It's my pleasure to welcome you all to First Monday, the monthly discussion forum hosted by the Public Diplomacy Council, the Public Diplomacy Association of America, and the USC Center on Public Diplomacy, as well as our home today, the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. I'm Brian Carlson, Vice President of the Public Diplomacy Council, standing in for Sherry Mueller, the PDC President, who's on travel. Adam Click-Powell from USC is, I think, also away, but we do have Jan Brandilla here with us, and, from PDAA President. And I know that there are people here today from the other important university public diplomacy programs, as well as many of you from the numerous NGOs, nonprofits, and organizations that work in public diplomacy. As a technical note and fair warning, both PDAA and PDC recognize that we have a lot of members who are out of the DC area and cannot attend, or maybe can't attend for some reason, First Monday events. And so we're trying to experiment today with a process of making a video recording of today's session, including even the Q&A part if we can. And if this is successful, we'll post it later on either YouTube or Venmo or someplace like that, whatever they order it is. Today's event is marking the 20th anniversary of a major reorganization of American diplomacy. It was the October 1, 1999 date when the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998 took effect. I'm sorry, it took effect in 1999. And the U.S. Information Agency's 6,352 employees, including their Foreign Service officers, as well as exchange, engagement, and information functions, were given to the U.S. Department of State. And at the same time, USIA's broadcasting employees went to the newly created Broadcasting Board of Governors. The causes, consequences, and the future of that foreign affairs realignment are our subject today. So I'd especially like to recognize and hand the microphone over to two people who had a tremendous role in conceiving of today's program. Deborah Trent and Mike Schneider identified a chairperson as well as distinguished speakers to address the different aspects of this. And so if I could figure out where Debbie went. There you are.
I have just an anecdote for everybody. The headline that was issued by the White House, does everyone know at least part of the background? Secretary Madeleine Albright was desperate to get the Chemical Weapons Treaty approved on the floor of the Senate, and Senator Jesse Helms was holding that up. And so began a negotiation in which Senator Helms, as most of you know, a very conservative traditionalist, bargained with the Secretary. He had long had it in for the Department of State, and he wanted reform. The outlines of those reforms were unclear, but he wanted a merger. He tried to get USAID and USIA to be merged in the state, but USAID's leader, Ryan Atwood, had a lot of clout on the Hill, having been the staff chief for the Church Committee. And he was able to basically avoid integration fully in the dotted line with permutations over the last 20 years. But USIA and ACDA, for various reasons, weren't so lucky. The headline from the White House was, and this will amuse you, the era of big government is over. ... USIA, ACDA to merge the State Department. Small fish by comparison. So that's among the many trivial explanations for what happened to us.
So I just wanted to say thank you for coming today. I feel like we all do in the council and the PDAA, like this is a really precious and important community of advocates and also educators, and we welcome your comments and your questions after the presentations go forth. And thank you very much to Cynthia and the rest of the panel. And here we go, Cynthia.
Thanks. Just one additional comment. I'm sure that Secretary Albright had serious reasons for the integration. Long-held views probably that public diplomacy is better within the Department of State separately, and that will come out in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I on? Okay. Thank you, Brian. And I want to also thank Debbie Trin and Mike Schneider for organizing this panel and asking us to participate. And it sure is hard to believe that 2 decades have gone by since USIA was incorporated into the State Department. And this is an important milestone for us to look back over the evolution of public diplomacy at state over those 20 years. And the implications of that history for the future of the U.S. practice of public diplomacy. Just to frame the discussion a little bit, I think what we're asking now is how effectively has the U.S. carried out during those 20 years the mandates of public diplomacy? How effectively are we explaining and influencing foreign policies to support U.S. foreign policy objectives? To what extent are we encouraging an understanding of U.S. society, culture, and values in foreign public? And to what extent are we working with private sector and NGOs to support contacts between the people of the United States and the peoples of the world? That might be a fairly old-fashioned way of describing public diplomacy, but I think it's still very valid. Now, I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about some data points from my own career. I'm going to make all the introductions extremely brief. This is a very distinguished panel, but we want to spend our time talking, and all of you have your sheets which have our extensive biographies. But we have our perspectives from our own careers that I think will shine lights on different facets of this important subject. In my own case, in 1999, at the time of the merger, I was in Moscow. I was the number 2 person in the public diplomacy public diplomacy office. I saw the merger, therefore, from a field perspective. How would we maintain the flexibility, our transportation assets, our contracting, our ability to do long-range financial planning? How would we be able to do that within the state context? Would we maintain enough independence to work on those broader mandates, U.S. society and values, as opposed to just influencing acceptance of U.S. foreign policy? Would we be allowed to represent all of civil society, or would we be forced or encouraged to be administration spokespeople only? How could we work long-term, or would we be forced more and more into working just short-term? Well, the answer, at least in Moscow, and at least immediately, was that we had to engage in a series of negotiations, and those of you who were in the field at that time know, where we worked out modus vivendi. And they were fairly successful, especially because I think for most of us, our ambassadors very much believed that public diplomacy was essential to diplomacy. And they wanted us to successfully be able to continue what we had done so well up to that point. We also had the great support from people in Washington who were fighting the good fights back there and ensuring that both from a personnel as well as from a resource standpoint as well as from a structural standpoint, that we had the structures that could nest successfully within existing state paradigms. Now, 4 years later, I was the PDPA officer for the Africa continent within State Department. And I was working with the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. In those cases, first with Charlotte Beers, and then with Margaret Tutwiler. And we were, and the other PD office directors, names to conjure with in my mind. But we were trying to resurrect strategic planning, analysis and planning tools, because the strategic tools, the coming up with a coherent country plan, coming up with a analysis of the influence structures within our countries, has sort of fallen by the wayside. And although there was adequate funding, thanks to people who had worked so hard, it was often focused on Washington headquarters objectives as opposed to what the field saw was essential. At least this is the way it looked to me from my standpoint. But we started having meetings, and it seemed like we were moving forward to create some substitutes for these tried and true methods. Then, a few years later, I was ambassador in Angola, and I was concerned because my staff was so much smaller, so much younger, so much less experienced than what I would have thought for an important post at that time. And also, I was concerned that perhaps there was not the understanding of what we were doing. You can see I say we. I was ambassador, but I never lost my identification, at least in my own mind, as a PD officer. Finally, for the last 4 years, I've had the honor of teaching the Senior Public Diplomacy Seminar for FSI. I have had excellent senior OIs, O1 officers. The majority of them are either now or are destined for the Senior Foreign Service, and I have been very impressed. I've been so impressed by the work they've been doing. Many of you will remember Bruce Wharton and others have reinstituted some of the planning documents. They've gone through a series of different formats, but they're there again. I'm so proud of what I see that these people are able to accomplish. But I remain concerned about their morale, about their feeling that maybe within State Department they are not as valued as they ought to be, that their role as strategic thinkers as opposed to just implementers aren't always recognized. Finally, another of the jobs that I've done since retiring has been to be president and now president emerita of the PDAA. And I'm so pleased with the awards that we hand out every year. When I look at the good work that's being done by Foreign Service officers, by our colleagues in the civil service, by our locally employed staff, by the outstanding results that they're having around the world, I remain very hopeful about the future of public diplomacy. Okay, I'm not going to speak anymore because we have many more interesting people, much more interesting than me, to talk about all these subjects in greater detail. And I want to introduce the panel very briefly and tell you where I think their careers will be useful in illuminating these subjects, but I leave it to them to actually decide which of these questions they're going to answer. To my left, and the one I will call on first, is Ambassador Kenton. He was with the USIA for 32 years. After the merger decision, he represented USIA on the Interagency Planning Committee. Then he went on to be the Senior Vice President at Meridian International Center. I think none of us should forget that all the things we're talking about within the State Department are only possible because of the good work that's done in the private sector. And so Kenton also had a big role there. And then finally, starting in 2010, he was a team leader in the Office of the Inspector General, looking at what was going on overseas, but also at the Broadcasting Board of Governors. So he has a very broad background. The time of the merger, work in the private sector, and then looking more recently at the actual work under the IPs. Our second speaker, Ambassador Jean Maines, she's going to go on to be the Deputy Commander at Southern Command. She was recently Ambassador to El Salvador. which I think gives her that particular view of having worked in the office and then worked supervising the office. But maybe more important, she's known for her leadership in public engagement and fiscal management, which is not surprising because she was the deputy principal coordinator for IIP and led the transformation of American spaces. And she oversaw $1.2 billion in domestic and worldwide resources as the Director of Resources for the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. So as far as someone who really can tell you what was going on as we moved through the merger, I think Jean is a perfect person to speak to that. And finally, my friend Shawn Powers, who is currently the Acting Chief Strategy Officer at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM. You all know that's the Board of Broadcasting. No. Any rate, he's positioning that agency within the broader U.S. government and key stakeholders. I think we don't want to forget the importance to public diplomacy of broadcasting, and I'm delighted that Shawn is here to help us do that. But he was also the Executive Director of the United States Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, which gave him the writ from Congress to oversee and promote all the public diplomacy activities. So let me stop there, and we'll ask each of them to speak very shortly, because I know all of you have interesting perspectives as well that you want to be able to contribute. So.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's the biggest challenge of all, is to keep it short. I need to start by extending Mike's, what was it? Yeah, your anecdote about Senator Helms. Actually, the irony of it all is during the planning process and the merger process, our earlier discussions, I actually talked to his senior aide, and she said, well, you know, Senator is not mad at USIA. Senator kind of likes USIA. It's AID he wants. And of course, AID is the one that slipped through the net, pretty much. All of us at USIA that I knew, one or two exceptions maybe, disagreed with the decision to merge the foreign affairs agencies. We didn't know anything about the arms control people, and what we knew about USAID made it clear in our minds that it was best for them to be off independently doing what they do and do well. And as far as USIA is concerned, we were under no illusions that USIA would be looked upon in the State Department as a lesser entity. There were no illusions about that, but we hoped that we would be able to protect the function of public diplomacy within the State Department. And there were some reasons to think that that might be possible in the early days. The State Department representatives in the negotiating process were very well chosen. Some of them knew something about USIA. And all of them seemed to want to know more. And the director of my State Department colleague, counterpart, said she was so happy with the merger because USIA was going to bring creativity and personality and change the State Department in ways that it needed to be changed. And in order to achieve that, there was a plan to have a reform committee looking at all of the elements of this merger. Everybody was going to be looked at with the objective of finding ways to do things better, get rid of bad practices, and so on. It was going to be no holds barred. It was everything on the table. And the whole State Department clearance process, for example, was going to be thoroughly studied. Nobody liked it. And of all of the elements in the merger process that were going to be reformed, studied for reform purposes, the only one that never met, the only one that never had a chief, the only one that just ignored the process altogether was the State Department. And so I guess we should have been aware that that wasn't going to work very well. Our task was to put together a blueprint for the merger and have it on the President's desk by the 15th of July. That is a date that will live in infamy as far as I was concerned, because I had, we worked so hard to get that thing together. And it never got to the President's desk. It got to the Secretary of State's desk. And what she saw in it, I don't know. But the blueprint obviously didn't thrill her. And she gave it to her secretary, Undersecretary for Management Affairs, and said, fix this and do with it what makes the most sense. So a lot of the process that we went through was wasted. But not all of it. A lot of it was wasted. Our concerns, when talking to our colleagues around the world and in Washington, our concerns were, and I'll speed this up because I don't want to go too far, but or too long. We wanted to know if we thought the public diplomacy function could actually thrive in the in an agency in the State Department whose methods of operations and institutional values differed so widely from those of USIA. It recalled that people in USIA, officers in USIA, and civil service specialists in USIA were recruited for special talents. And they were recruited for, promoted for a special, certain kinds of achievement. That was different from the State Department. Could that work in the State Department in a new merged organization? We worried that in the process of seeking savings from the amalgamation, that USIA employees might actually have to absorb a disproportionate share of the pain. Disproportionately have people who were laid off or services no longer required. I will say here that we were all pleasantly surprised that that was not a problem. Probably because of an excellent and very ethical Director of the Foreign Service, Director General of the Foreign Service, who made the promise that that would not happen, and he held his word. We worried about how the exchange programs would fare in the budget battles at state. And we fought very hard to keep the budget item, line item, intact to go to Congress, rather than have the exchange's budgets folded into the State Department's operating budget, competing with the need for new furniture and consular sections. And I don't have anything against consular sections, but I just could not see, I was not confident that we would be able, in the budget battles, to hold out. And we were successful in keeping those line items intact for the Congress to examine. Congress wanted it. We had been told, actually, just before the end of the process, decision has been made. Those funds will go into the State Department general budget fund, operating fund, and then the Hill got wind of it, and and others did as well, and the pressure was so fast and so impressive that that was changed. For me, one of my greatest concerns was that with the loss of the area office management structure that existed in USIA, who would ensure the strategic public diplomacy planning process? Who would ensure the quality of tradecraft and tradecraft training of the public diplomacy operators in the field? How would we be able to marry a public affairs function within the State Department, whose job was actually to reach out to the American public, with public diplomacy function prohibited from reaching out to the American public? How was that going to work in a State Department setting? And then with the dawn of the digital age, most of us, when I think of it 20 years ago, how little we knew and how rapidly we would discover the importance of our digital combat in the world. But who would ensure that public diplomacy within the State Department would adopt the tools and practices that the new realities were to bring? One of the early battles we had in these discussions was the battle over communications and communications settings. A State Department that had an interest in more and more security for its output, for its communications, and a U.S. information agency component that was more and more interested in getting more information out to the world. That argument went back and forth until finally I think it was decided that you had to have two. I think maybe I should stop there. I have 1,000 anecdotes, especially during the process, if you can imagine being in the basement of the State Department in an airless room with people who didn't want to really be there, for looking at each other and arguing about various things. And it was a process that at least deserved to be examined by the Secretary of State, and that never happened. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the joys of moderating a discussion with PD colleagues is that everybody is so disciplined.
We'll see about that.
Yeah.
So first of all, let me just say, when the merger happened, I was 7 years into the department. And so we don't know, our generation and the generation after owes an enormous responsibility and gratitude to the work that was done. Because it was people in those back rooms, the airless rooms, looking across from each other, the reason that public diplomacy still exists today. You know, people don't forget that that separate account was in jeopardy up until the last minute. And I had the privilege to be working with Stan Silverman at the time, when that was all interplaying. I was, a low-level person watching this all go back and forth. And if that had not happened, public diplomacy would not exist today. And so for our generation and the generations that come, it's important to remember that. It's important to remember the battles that went on, the fights that were made to protect what we know as public diplomacy. And so from the role that I'm just coming out of as U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador, public diplomacy was front and center. We are the 5th largest mission in the Western Hemisphere, and our issues were on front pages all the last years on migration, on security related to MS-13, on a number of things that were and continue to be White House priorities. And I can tell you, we led with public diplomacy. And the public diplomacy has never been more important. And why that matters is because people matter. And so when I turn to the public diplomacy arm, and I will say that probably it's the worst nightmare of any public affairs section to have a PD-coned ambassador. And probably the greatest gift. Because, you know, I absolutely 100% own up and admit to, I am incredibly demanding with the PD section. And that is because I understand the power, and I believe in it. And so making sure that we were fully engaged on every policy issue, making sure that our 19 agencies across that mission were not just sharing information, but then we were building and leveraging every issue. The public diplomacy shop led that. When we had and faced Chinese expansion in El Salvador, the first section I turned to was public diplomacy. So where's the public on this? What does the public know about Chinese tactics? What do our interlocutors think? What are people who care about the environment or human rights or labor rights? Do they know what's happening? Do they know what the Chinese are trying to do? You know, that goes straight to the public diplomacy section. And then they help lead the effort to bring all of the rest of the agencies on board and to get people educated about tactics, what's happening, what we could do. And I can tell you, you know, public opinion for China went from 87% to 7% in a 6-month period. That's public diplomacy. And that's really getting information out to people, understanding what's at stake. And that, to me, I think, the value of public diplomacy being integral, integrated into the department is important. And I will say, you know, having come back and been in IAP, and Tom Cochran's here in the front row, so he'll keep me honest. When we looked at American spaces, you know, in my previous job as Director of Resources with Undersecretary McHale, I remember being in that budget meeting with Deputy Secretary Nides at the time, and we were trying to defend American spaces. And Deputy Secretary Knight asked a question. He said, well, how many do we have, and where are they? And we looked at each other, and we didn't know. Because we had no central organization or management of American spaces. We didn't know where they were no standards. We didn't really take responsibility. Every post did their own thing, and I see Ann Barbara back there laughing. You know, and all that has value when posts are allowed to do their own thing. I think I appreciate that. But at some point, at an organizational level, you have to have structure. And the way we were funding American Spaces was basically at the end of every fiscal year, whatever money was left, we threw at American Spaces. And that's how it worked. That's how it worked until we went through position by position after integration. I've done a 2-year process to find where every PD position was in the world that public diplomacy funds were paying for. Everyone. I mean, just, you know, brutal work going through every single position worldwide. And we found 200 positions that were being paid out of public diplomacy funds that were public affairs. $22 million base budget. We took that $22 million, 15 of it went to start the Office of American Spaces. And that guaranteed priority and budget on a regular basis. If they're important, you have to fund it. It can't be we wait for some budget, you know, free-for-all at the end of the year and we throw it at an issue. If it's important, you budget for it. And that's how we started that office. And that's how we started the standards. And then you became to defend it. The other issue that I see, there are a couple things, you know, some things have remained the same and some things have changed. What remains the same is relationships matter. And I think today they matter even more. I will say I think we are the most connected, disconnected generation. We're the most connected, disconnected generation. And I say that because we have access to so much information, but our circles are so small. And I sort of refer to it as digital isolation. We select our friends, we select who we follow, we reinforce our own opinions. If anybody tries to interject a new opinion, the whole group jumps on that person. And so in some ways we have so much information, but we've really narrowed our own thinking. And so public diplomacy and the ability to create spaces where people come in and they focus on an issue, on finding a way forward, on focusing on the 80% that they agree on, those spaces are increasingly few and far between. Instead, we arrive with an opinion. We arrive with a position. And we start defending the position before we ever focused on the issue. And so for me, public diplomacy brings that kind of value of how you can really keep those spaces focused on an issue and then really get people to focus on the 80% that they agree on and get that done. And so all of our work in terms of social media, engagement spaces, people in El Salvador think I'm like Twitter obsessed. You know, I'm not Twitter obsessed, but I do believe you have to go where the conversation is happening. And in most countries, a lot of that is unclear. And so if you're not there, the conversation's happening without you. So you can decide, do you want to participate or not participate? That's a choice. And so I learned that from Macon Phyllis and Tom Cochran. You go where the conversation is. And it has to be a conversation. It can't be, as an ambassador, you're just spewing talking points. It has no effect on people. People want to know you, they want to feel you, they want to feel that you feel them. It's all about the relationship. And you can do that on social. In El Salvador, we had the ambassador account was the second most influential account in the country next to the president. And we led on every issue, whether it was financial agreements, security, human rights, was led from that embassy. And so that's the power of public diplomacy. And that's why our people matter. If it's off to the side, I know we all grew up hearing the last 3 feet. Frankly, at this point where we are, not only in the United States, but increasingly in country after country around the world, it's the first 3 feet. You have to get people to the first 3 feet because the walls are already up and the defenses are up. We're already in our position and we're in to defend. We're not even listening to how to get to a solution. And so for public diplomacy, it's how do you really get people back off their position and into an issue. And so at some point, that is part of where public diplomacy is today. And I would say it's never been more powerful, never been more influential. And our impact is never more needed and necessary in our country and around the world. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shawn.
Shawn, please.
Tough acts to follow, folks. First of all, thank you to my panelists for sharing the stage. Thank you to Debbie Trent, Michael Schneider, Ambassador Efird, and of course all those working behind the scenes to make this such a productive and engaging event. As you may have noticed, I am the odd person out. I do not carry the rank of ambassador, nor will I ever carry the rank of ambassador. I don't have the grace or the patience to do the tremendous work that my friends here do. But needless to say, I'm thrilled to be here and hope I can contribute some thoughts to the conversation. Everyone sort of mentioned where they were at the merger day, M-Day. And so I think it's important for me to mention too, because it does frame the way I think about the issue. I was a freshman in college in Athens, Georgia, getting acquainted to the University of Georgia Bulldogs. And I mention that because when I was thinking about my remarks for today's discussion, I really brought a scientific approach to the question of what did the merger mean? Was it good? Was it bad? And what do we do with it? And I think I can do that because I had no idea what USIA was when I was a freshman in college in Athens, Georgia. And as I was drawing these up this weekend, I realized that I may offend some people, but not intentionally, of course. But I hope that the provocations can make us think not just about what went right and what went wrong, but how do we think about where we want to be in 20 years? And how do we build the right structures, cultivate the right leadership, and pursue the best ideas to help us get there in 20 years? When I started thinking about this, it was really important for me to address 2 questions. First was, what value does having public diplomacy in the formal bureaucratic institution of the State Department, what value does that add to the various public diplomacy practitioners and activities that they pursue? And then second, as I started to break that down, I realized, at least for me, I had to think about that question in 3 different ways. First is, when we think about the traditional strategic communication, public affairs, digital diplomacy functions of the State Department, the functions that are currently carried out by the Bureau of Global Public Affairs and the Global Engagement Center. What value added does being part of the formal State Department bureaucratic structure provide? And what risks are involved as well? Separately, how do we think about exchange programs administered by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs? And do they carry the same risks and benefits for being involved in the formal State Department bureaucracy, or are there a different set of calculations there that maybe should allow us to think differently about how that institution or those programs could be structured vis-a-vis the rest of the U.S. government? And then thirdly, how do those questions about integration with state or non-integration with state function vis-a-vis the U.S. Agency for Global Media, formerly known as the Broadcasting Board of Governors? And I'll start there because, first of all, that's where I currently work. It's easiest for me to think about. But I think it does provide a very different model from the ones that many folks in this room think about when they think about the merger between USIA and the State Department. While it sounds like there was not a lot of excitement about the merger amongst PD practitioners at the time, there are some really tremendous accounts actually that Voice of America employees celebrated the 1999 merger of USIA into the State Department because it created a formal independent federal entity that would further the protections for the journalists of Voice of America and the other surrogate news networks. So a very different reaction from those that we saw from PD practitioners at USIA. Whether or not that excitement was well-founded, I think, is a legitimate question, but it's worth noting that the merger, on the one hand, actually it set in motion a direction of greater independence for USAGM from the State Department than it had previously enjoyed. And I think that really is crucial to thinking about whether or not it was a good or bad thing for U.S. public sector journalism abroad. I spent this morning going back through some performance and accountability reports. As close as I could get to 1999, our archive headed back to 2004. So I thought I would kind of compare where the agency was in 2004 compared to where it is in 2019. In 2004, USAGM's budget was $705 million. It had 1,200 affiliate relationships. That is, it had 1,200 different local TV and radio operations around the world carrying mostly Voice of America content for local audiences, in addition to its global satellite radio distribution networks. The agency broadcast in 56 languages, and it reached 146 million adults on a weekly basis. So budget, 705, 1,200 affiliates, 56 languages, and 146 million adults, 2004. 2018, USAGM's budget is $808 million, so not even, just about 100 million more than it was in 2004. We have 3,200 affiliates, so 2,000 more affiliate relationships than we had in 2004. The agency broadcasts in 61 or 62 languages, depending on how we count Hungary, which we formally launched last week, but it'll still be a few months before we have things operational. And we reach 345 million adults on a weekly basis. So from a performance perspective alone, you have to at least lend credence to the hypothesis that the independence that the agency gained after the merger between USIA and the State Department helped it become a more impactful organization around the world. But that's debatable, and how you credit the gains that the agency has made in the past 20 years, I think, is a crucial part of that. But at least on the surface, one can say that the merger between USIA and State was good for U.S. public service media that faces our international audiences. One thing that I've realized since moving over from the commission to USAGM is that the agency's independent status and its relatively small size allows it to move a lot faster than most bureaus can move at the State Department. And it provides a certain kind of level of agility, which is really helpful when you're operating in the global media environment. So we're able to stand up programs at a scale that is quite impressive, at a pace that I would not ever predict would be possible if we were part of the formal State Department apparatus. I'll give two examples. One is the past year, we stood up a refugee radio operation, which started a budget-neutral refugee radio operation, which is to say we found the resources to stand up a new Rohingya news organization that beams Rohingya language content into Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. A really, really important project for anyone who understands the situation in these camps. They are information-deprived refugee populations writ large, are some of the most information-deprived groups in the entire world. There probably is no better way for us to use our resources than to try to get in-language content, objective news to these folks, which, by the way, communities of refugees are only growing and will only continue to grow moving forward. We were able to not just launch that program, but also start to scale it in the Middle East and parts of Africa with other refugee communities in a span of about 6 months. And again, we just reallocated resources internally, and because the size of the agency is relatively small, there are fewer desks that need to clear on these kinds of decisions, and it allows us to move quicker. A second example, and I promise I have lots of criticisms of the agency too, but I do want to focus on some positive examples. The second example is we were able to launch a joint channel with the BBC, the French government, Deutsche Welle, the German public broadcaster, and Voice of America in Turkey, so it's a co-branded Turkish language channel that actually brings in content from each of those 4 different governments and disseminates it all around Turkey. The first time we've ever had a collaborative program with 3 other governments in the broadcasting space. As you can imagine, there's all sorts of logistical challenges. Who decides the final editorial content? Whose brand carries the mark the most? There's different bilateral relationships between the governments involved. So how do we make sure that we're respectful of each of the bilateral relationships while also pursuing our mission? This has actually turned out to be a massive success. We've seen our audience numbers quadruple in the past 3 months. We're actually now sending other services to Istanbul to learn from how the collaborative project is working, to see if there are other opportunities for us to work with other broadcasters. And again, when I asked about some similar kinds of multilateral public diplomacy initiatives a few months ago when I was working with some colleagues at the State Department, there were a lot of folks that said, that's a really good idea. We should do a lot more of that, but it's quite difficult. The bureaucratic structures at the State Department don't facilitate that kind of thinking in the same way that I think the independent agency model does. One last thing I'd mention about why it was good for USAGM is splitting away from USIA and splitting away from the State Department really allowed USAGM to focus on a very specific mission, which is informing, engaging citizens around the world for the purpose of promoting democracy and freedom. That's the mission. And so we can measure the success or failure of every single broadcast that we do vis-a-vis that mission. That simplistic mission allows us to focus on resources and our talents, I think, in a way that's a bit more difficult when you're working in a dynamic foreign policy environment such as folks at the State Department do. Looking at exchange programs, this is where I think I may not intentionally offend people, but at a minimum maybe provocative. So are exchange programs better off administered by the Department of State? Does proximity to the policymaking apparatus improve the quality of an exchange program? Is the State Department's bureaucracy a good fit for administering exchange programs and managing that important relationship with the private sector implementing partners that really do so much of the important work that exchange programs need? And when I look at that, I have some questions. And again, this isn't to say I'm calling for pulling out exchange programs from the State Department, but it does not seem to be as good of a fit as other parts of the public diplomacy apparatus. Bureaucratically speaking, ECA is dependent on some highly effective relationships with its implementing partners, and I always wonder if the federal contracting process is the best way to establish a solid working relationship between an implementing partner and the U.S. government. I think that it creates hurdles and challenges that may not be ideal for that kind of really collegial and highly effective partnership. I think the fact that ECA still has a separate congressional earmark is clearly important for the reasons that we heard, but it also furthers, I think it's slowed down ECA's full integration into the State Department, and at least for my time at the Commission, certainly created resentment amongst folks who weren't on the ECA side but were working with the public diplomacy apparatus, because they often ask, where is our earmark from Congress? Where are our guaranteed resources to make sure that our programs are protected too? And I think it's not going beyond the pale to say that there is still some ambiguity about how much of the mission of exchange programs, which classically were thought of as promoting mutual understanding for the purposes of creating a more peaceful world, is perfectly aligned with the State Department, whose mission is much more foreign policy centric and dependent, of course, on the folks who occupy the White House and the 7th floor of the State Department. Are those two different missions really meant to be perfectly aligned side by side? And then I just remind folks that this is by no means a suggestion that exchange programs should be privatized or pulled out of the U.S. government. There are numerous models that allow for robust federal support for programs that don't require full integration with the State Department or any other federal agency. The National Endowment for Democracy presents an interesting model. USIP presents an interesting model. Both of these are robustly funded and have tremendous support on the Hill, and also have tremendous value across key stakeholders in Washington, D.C. and across the country. So this is not by any means suggesting that we should limit our exchange program activities. I'm not sure, looking back, if that is the best fit. Finally, looking at GPA and GEC, the same question is asked. Are these best implemented with a close formal relationship with the State Department? And I think the answer is yes. I think that in fact, the emergence of the Global Public Affairs Bureau is a good example of just how important it is to have a tight relationship between your public affairs, strategic communication apparatus, and the policymakers that be. That close relationship, of course, gives those public diplomacy practitioners and their messages relevance because they're speaking as close to the policymaking apparatus as possible so that it's highly relevant to stakeholders around the world. It gives them an opportunity to influence the policymaking process, something that public diplomacy practitioners have talked about the importance of for decades and decades. It also helps to ensure that the thoughts, the innovations, and the services that these professionals have really perfected over the course of time can be quickly deployed at the embassy with our ambassadors, which I think we heard some really tremendous examples of from Ambassador Maines. Integration into the State Department also, I think, ensures the high level of professionalization of public diplomacy practitioners, and most importantly, ensures that they're treated as equals vis-a-vis other foreign service officers, which helps recruitment and make sure that we are bringing on and retaining the most talented professionals for these kinds of jobs. And I kind of think that on the question of bureaucracy, the State Department's bureaucracy can be tedious, but on this, it can also be quite helpful. We really want every U.S. ambassador tweeting whatever they think, whatever they want. Or would it be good for them to have some rules and guidelines that they were trained on, that were kind of thought about and tested by U.S. State Department officials, right? So I think that the bureaucratic apparatus of state actually helps ensure that new tools and technologies are deployed in the field, but they're deployed intelligently and smartly. And that bureaucratic check is quite important for the kinds of functions that we expect our PD practitioners and the chiefs of missions to pursue. 4 quick concluding thoughts, and I know I've gone over my time. I'm going to channel a friend and colleague, Jonathan Hennick, when I say structures are overrated. It is easy for us, he told me this, by the way, when I was at the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, looking at questions of reorganization. And he said, Shawn, structures are overrated. They're easy things to target. They're easy things to blame. No one's going to stand up and defend a bureaucracy. But they're oftentimes not really the part of the problem that we need to focus on. And I think it's an important lesson to think about right now. Sure, we could create better structures to enable and support public diplomacy practitioners across the 3 functions I mentioned. But it's also really important to focus on activities and ideas, because what we have learned, I think, is that structures move with good leadership and good ideas. The second point I'd like to make is, across any good example of public diplomacy or reform in the past 20 years, more than the structures involved are the leaders involved. I can't help but think about the leadership that Ambassador Maines has provided to any number of her colleagues across the State Department. My former boss, John Lansing, the previous CEO of USAGM, who's now the CEO of NPR, provided leadership to his staff that really helped USAGM become a much more modern and agile news organization. None of these had to do with structures per se. It is finding the right leaders and empowering them and enabling them and giving them the resources they need to really lead teams of effective public diplomats. And the last thing I'd say is to go back to one lesson from USAGM. The more clearly defined a mission is, the more successful we're going to be. And it's easy for me to put on my USAGM hat and say we've got a clearly defined mission, we're focusing on promoting freedom and democracy around the world, and that's it. What is that specific mission going to be when it comes to GPA? What is that specific mission going to be when it comes to exchange programs? And if we can hone in those missions, can we create more effective institutions to pursue those ideals? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And I'd like to thank the panel. Although I would like to say that we've taken a quick poll, and 3 out of the 4 people in front think ambassadors should be allowed to do whatever they want. I think, Debbie, are you going to take the questions, or should I?
Please do.
Okay, before I do, and while you all are thinking your questions, because we have such disciplined people, we have a good half hour to talk, and I think we have lots of substance. But just to make clear, we were talking in sort of a historical perspective, and the history of State Department changed as of April, when the structures that many of us worked on were changed in order to create GPA and other things. So last summer, summer before last, Pompeo authorized the International Program Acting Coordinator and Michelle Gaida to look at a PAI-IP merger. And that was then finally approved by all Congress and everybody in April, after much discussion. I'm mentioning this just because I think we need to make sure that we understand some of the things that Shawn was talking about toward the end. And so what happened? Several entities moved around. So ECA, Educational Cultural Affairs, took over or welcomed American Spaces, the Speaker Program, and tent camps that had previously been in the International Information Programs. Our RIPR, the Policy and Program Resource people, yeah, they became the new home for regional and functional strategy networks and the judicial liaison from International Information Programs, as well as the U.S. Diplomatic Center from PA. And then finally, FSI took on the Office of Historian from PA and put it into their family. Now, this is all too complicated to throw into the end of this panel. But I do want to tell you, we are looking to having another program in the future which will pull us up to date on all these subjects, so we can stay on maybe a more general historical sphere level while we're talking today. But I did want to tell you, you can look at online, the Heritage Foundation did a pretty good panel a couple weeks ago, if you want to get an immediate response. But also, we will have a program to look at this in the future. So let's stop here and we'll go on to questions. I see quite a lot. Let's start. Introduce, we'll try to be brief so we get as many in as possible.
Thank you. Michael Horp from PDAA. We're having a luncheon program on November 18th that's going to look at the reorganization of public affairs and public diplomacy. You're all most welcome to join us. You can sign up on our website, pdaa.publicdiplomacy.org. Look forward to seeing you all.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Hi there, my name is Julie Moyers, and I think I was one of the first of the generation of state PD officers. I was a state officer, and I had the opportunity to transfer over to PD in a very competitive process. And I just wanted to say thank you to all the USIA people who would welcome me, because I was a little apprehensive coming from state that I would not be warmly welcomed. I was, and thanks especially Rick Ruth, who's not in this room, but who actually served as a mentor, and all the people in the geographic bureaus that worked with me to try to find a mid-level assignment that would work well for me. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who made me feel so welcome. Thank you.
Vivian Walker with the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, filling a very big pair of shoes. Thank you very much. Great panel. It was wonderful to hear from all of you. Just one clarification and one question. Some of you may recall that we did do a public advisory meeting on the GPA that I think launched this current series of inquiries that are ongoing. And we will shortly have the transcript of those proceedings available so we can add that to our body of knowledge on the transition. My question is this: having listened to the discussion about how public diplomacy fits into state or doesn't, and thanks, Shawn, for your insights, I actually want to ask a historical question, and this is really directed, I think, at Kenton Keith. I was a young USIA officer when this transition took place, and it was all pretty obscure to me from my remote location at the time in Kazakhstan. And what I would like to know more about is what went into the decision-making, into the distribution of the various offices within the Department of State. You know, the area offices end up in part regional offices under the direction of the assistant secretaries for the regions. Then there was, then ECA was a standalone, and RIPR was born, IIP came in there at some point. I'm curious about the thinking initially about how this would all fit in the department, because I think that would perhaps help us to better understand where we are today.
I'm not sure I can answer that. In the discussions about public affairs versus public diplomacy and who was going to be responsible for public affairs, there was a paucity of understanding, even within the department, of the difference between public affairs and public diplomacy. Very simple, but that did exist. I do not recall a series of discussions of the kind that you described on that issue or on a lot of other issues. There was a lot of should we change this or this distribution, and if so, why and how? But nobody came forward with, as far as I know, nobody came forward with a plan for the redistribution of geographic responsibilities or anything of that nature. Brian?
Could I say a word about this? It's just a bit of history. I was in EUR at the time, and based on the relationship that Miller Crouch, my predecessor, had built up with the state and with Mark Grossman, we actually began a process before the reorganization was mandated and even thought about. But we had started a process of merging our public diplomacy office at USIA with the Assistant Secretary for Europe at State, and they gave us proper space in the department in EUR spaces, and we had people working over there 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and basically working it out so that a desk officer from USIA worked particularly with a regional office within the bureau within EUR, groups and subgroups and so forth. And it had already started. And so I think when the legislation came through, most people looked around and said, well, that looks like what we ought to just move the area offices to the assistant secretaries of the regional bureaus. And I think that's what happened.
Yep.
The problem in that is one of bureaucratic heft. When you move the public diplomacy section, public diplomacy geographic bureau, geographic office into a European or African area bureau in state, what is the rank of the public diplomacy person going to be? Somebody who has responsibility for public diplomacy in that office needs to have bureaucratic standing. He needs to be able to go to the meetings and to fight for the budgets and to be in the posse, not in the wagon that comes from behind. I mean, that's why we were hoping that the public diplomacy officer in the bureaus would be at the deputy assistant secretary level. Otherwise, they get lost in the ether.
I think what's interesting is each bureau ended up working it out somewhat differently. And so you had the model where you would all the bureaus now have a DAS responsible for public diplomacy. Very few of them are public diplomacy officers.
But the strength with which that was fought.
Yeah. So usually, and then there's a question, if you have a public diplomacy DAS, and then you have a public diplomacy office director, are they basically doing the same thing? If you ask me, one of the best models is you have a public diplomacy plus something else, DAS. And then the public diplomacy office director is given a whole lot of freedom. But each bureau has done it differently. They've also done differently whether the public diplomacy office has most of the public diplomacy officers back at headquarters, Or are the public diplomacy people sitting with the various offices? So, and in general, the majority of the bureaus now have public diplomacy officers sitting at the various desks. But that's not a universal solution. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, I bring multiple perspectives, starting when Brian and I were both policy officers for USIA regional offices. And we felt, me under the guidance of Ambassador William Rue, that we didn't have enough traction with our State Department regional equivalents. So we started encouraging people to attend meetings and to get woven into that structure, and I think that had an effect. It also affected my thinking when right before the merger, I more or less was in charge of the discussions around integrating into the public diplomacy offices into the regional and the global issue bureaus. I'm using that term very carefully. I think the beefing up of public diplomacy resources in global issue bureaus was a big plus that we gained using integration, frankly, as a convenient pedal, you know what I mean. The second thing is, I think, to quote the Edward R. Murrow cliche about being in on the takeoffs as well as the hard landings, I think that integration of public diplomacy talent in different ways, bon gré, mal gré, some better than others, did overall achieve that. I look at my own experience being the public diplomacy office director in East Asia during a critical time in negotiations around the Koreas, and that I and my Korea experts absolutely had a seat at the table. We were listened to, we were solicited. I don't think that would have happened under USIA. The downside, I would say, is management. I would say management in an organization dominated by the political cone, as antiquated as that is a little too type B, not a hair or word out of place, go by the rules, whereas we were a program agency at USIA, and our job was implementing programs. I see this in so many arenas. I'm a REA now, I work in ECA, and I fill in overseas. Where I find it most egregious, and I never hear it mentioned in these discussions, is you look at public diplomacy sections overseas, the officers are spending half their time at least administering grants instead of listening. These are language-trained, competent officers they're not out there, they're not listening, filling in. I'm not going to mention the country, but last year as PAO, it was appalling how little contact the officers had with the people we're giving grants to. When I started out as a USIA officer in 1980, the smallest post had an American administrative officer.
That's right.
I am sorry.
That's me.
Now that we do so much by grant writing, we need that more than ever, and that right now is the most broken part of management. Thank you.
I know I have been looking over there.
Cynthia, can I go back just to
Yeah,
structure?
please, I'm sorry.
Just to structure for 1 second to Vivian's question. In terms of structure, one of the key components is the Undersecretary for Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy. And there is no doubt that our entire cone is at a disadvantage because we do not have a consistent confirmed Undersecretary. It plays out in every element, from the top to the bottom. It plays out in leadership, it plays out in direction, it plays out in whether PD officers get the chance to showcase your talent as an ambassador. It plays out in every element. I'm not sure if I would have been U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador if we had not had a confirmed Undersecretary in the room fighting and representing for PD officers what talent we bring to the table, what skills we could bring to the moment, how we could lead policy, and how we could get it done. The fact that we got the homicide rate down 50% in El Salvador, we were the #1 ICAS post 2 years running for the whole hemisphere. How you can get good PD officers showcasing what our skills do and how they matter, you have to have a confirmed Undersecretary. And for me, it starts from there and it just goes down the scale. When you don't have that, the person's not in the room, you're not at the table, you're not leading, you're not representing your people because you're not there. and you have to be on the 7th floor, you have to be in those conversations, otherwise you're just fighting against the stream. Some people end up squeaking by and making it, through another way, but you don't have your person at the top really showcasing why public diplomacy is so powerful when it's done right. And so I think, the continual fight to have somebody in that undersecretary role is absolutely essential for the future of public diplomacy.
Ambassador Quaid, you had your hand up.
Tony Quaidman, I guess I wasn't quite present at the creation. As I was going out as Director General of Foreign Service, the proposals were on the table. It's interesting to take one back to that time. What was the rationale? Well, there were various rationales. One was budgetary and consolidation. Senator Helms' interests, what we talked about. But the underlying rationale that we all talked about was what was lacking in the Foreign Service, the traditional Foreign Service, was an understanding of public diplomacy. That whether you were a political officer or an economic officer, whatever, you didn't know anything about public diplomacy. And what would be good for us was the integration, that public diplomacy would become part of the culture and not a separate agency which reported independently to ambassadors through the PAO, had his own staff and structure. And I wonder, those of you who have been dealing with this since, whether there's any truth to that expectation, that the culture of public diplomacy has infused the larger Foreign Service, which was one of the purposes, I wouldn't even say the principal purpose, but surely it was one of the purposes, was to make all of the officers in the Foreign Service sensitive to the fact that they were public diplomacy officers in some way, ought to be, and that they ought to understand the skills and knowledge that PD professionals brought to the table, but which they didn't always understand when it was a separate agency operating in embassies abroad. So I look back and I thought, well, that, as DG, that sounded like a reasonable proposition. Yes, let's make the Foreign Service more public diplomacy conscious, aware, and skilled. Whether that happened, because I then immediately walked out of the door into another life, I don't know, but I'd be interested in your comments about whether there has been a transformation of the State Department's culture, the Foreign Service's culture. The State Department's a different animal here. Because it seems to me that was where we started and where we hoped to come out when the Secretary and others agreed to the merger.
Okay, let me ask Kenton and Shawn to talk to this, if I may, because I think both of them have a fairly broad perspective.
I go back to the period some years after I left USIA and the State Department merger process per se, and I was in the office of the Inspector General. And needless to say, I paid special attention to public diplomacy issues. It is true that the appalling ignorance of many State Department officers of public diplomacy issues, policies, practices, and so on, that we knew in the good old days, has been greatly ameliorated. These DCMs and ambassadors talk about public diplomacy in evaluations, interagency evaluations. Officers are evaluated in many cases how they involve themselves in public diplomacy activity. I attended a conference at a university in Brazil where the DCM was doing a public diplomacy gig and doing it quite well. So I think that has been at least a partial success. On the other hand, I wonder what the statistics show about the greater possibility of public diplomacy cone officers becoming DCMs and ambassadors, which was the other side of that coin. Maybe my colleagues know better than I do because it's been a long time.
Shawn, what would you say to this?
Thank you for the invitation to comment, and I would defer to my colleagues, both on the panel and in this room, really. I think there's a lot more experience to answer this specific question, but I'll at least take a stab at it, which is, I think that there has been the transformation in the foreign service culture that allows for a greater appreciation of public diplomacy practitioners and the importance of public diplomacy in the overall practice of diplomacy. And that in and of itself is a major accomplishment. However, it doesn't feel like it's near complete. It doesn't feel like it's 35% complete maybe. But again, I also understand we're dealing with an institution and a bureaucracy and individuals, collection of individuals. It takes time to move these things. Crucial, I think, though, for really a transformation is to have more PD folks in leadership roles, in particular as ambassadors. I think that is really a key moment, and it's sort of a generational shift if you think about it in those terms, because it takes time, of course, for PD officers to climb the ranks, so to speak. So I'm hopeful that this trend will continue.
Could I just add one quick thing? In most embassies that I inspected, there is a new officer group that meets regularly and has input from senior officers in the mission and so on. And I made it a practice to sit in on those meetings as often as I could in the inspection process. And one thing that I just loved to see was how much of a presence the PD officers were, and how well they stood up in that sort of informal competition. And obviously, when that happens, the attitude toward public diplomacy is going to be shifted at that early stage.
I'm going to take.
I can mention just on chief of mission.
Please. Yes.
On chief of mission selection, sort of when we were first trying to get PD officers really to be considered for these positions, a lot of it was focused on, again, having a strong undersecretary be in the room when those decisions are made. Because basically you get in the room, there's a lot of very qualified candidates, and everybody's advocating for different people. And how that comes out at the end. If you have nobody at the table, there's no one advocating for you over somebody else. And so when we first started this process of seeing ambassadors from the PD cone, we were pretty, every time we would get one, we would celebrate in the Undersecretary's office about, oh my gosh, we got a PD cone officer into an ambassadorship, because we know how valuable that is to the system and how it makes a difference. Now we're at the stage of looking to where are those ambassadors being assigned? Are they being assigned to really important policy relevant countries? And are they getting a second and a third and a fourth? So for example, where are the Christy Kennys and the Tom Shannons of the PD cone? Where are you seeing that? Or is it one and done? And you get some small country because that's sort of the token PD ambassador. And so, I hear the laughter in the room, but that's important because that matters in terms of who's at the policy lead in the department. And that's where we are now. When we first started this process where you had the undersecretary in at the table on chief of mission selection, it was, okay, we're really glad to get a public diplomacy officer into an ambassador position. So if it's a small country, we'll still take it. Now you're at the point where it needs to be really looking beyond that to the future of policy important countries to the White House, and then where are they going for their second, third, fourth, fifth ambassadorship?
One thing, when I looked at the statistics, one of the unfortunate things was that not enough public diplomacy officers are putting themselves forward for the DCM slots or for the ambassadors, which speaks to other things. Now, what I'm going to do is take 4 questions that I noticed, comments, and then I'm going to let each of the panelists choose which ones they like to answer. So, which is terrible, but it's the best way of running here. Please.
Yes, my name is Shawn, and I had some close personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Come on, Chava.
And you're good.
Into the microphone.
Now you can hear me though.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I experienced at the immediate beginning of the merger, I was already retired. No, well, anyway, I went out on some TDYs to post to see what was going on. It was very clear at the outset that one of the things that you would expect from this type of a merger is the decapitation of the corporate culture. That's just natural. So that who was telling the up-and-coming officers who hadn't been in at all? Where were the showed us what the profession is as a craft. So the trade craft, as you mentioned, I think, Ambassador, definitely gone. Here's how I experienced that firsthand. The Bureau IO, I was sent to the Bureau of IO, I was recruited. I was working for the Chugach Eskimos at the time, which is another long story.
We're going to have to have a short story.
Here's a very short story. So I went out, there were new public affairs officers now at new posts, so that there were IO missions all over the UN area. Nobody knew anything. The head of the PD office was a career consular officer who was there to punch her ticket of administration, and it worked. Next, all of these poor people were first tour officers, and they had no idea what was going on. Third, Ambassador Bolton was then our ambassador at the UN. The public affairs officer was Richard Grinnell, who is now ambassador in Berlin. So I think you can understand the kind of stuff that went on. Finally, one more quick one. I did a TDY also in Riga. And I discovered that the brand new PA, I was sent out there because there was going to be a big summit, first ever NATO summit. I found out that the ambassador saw to it that the public diplomacy reports, so the media report, media reaction, was all sent to Kentucky. I was a little puzzled by that, thinking that this, unless there was a major shift in state policy, that we weren't feeding local press in America. But anyway, these are things that, and we spent a lot of time trying to get Mayor Giuliani into the NATO summit. That's about all I'll say for now.
Okay, we'll pass the microphone over here, please.
Thank you very much. I'm John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax, and I just want you all to address a long-standing issue, long time. In fact, it's been around so long, it was there before Carlos began his previous remarks. One of the things that has been written is that Secretary Pompeo is a strong Secretary of State, very much considered the strongest since Kissinger. Do you see him keeping the present structure in place or making a move to make any changes in it?
Okay, pass the microphone forward there.
I'm Barry Fulton. I retired from USIA the year before the merger. Two brief comments and a question. Soon after I retired, and in the interim before the merger in September 30th, 1999, I was invited by Ruth Davis to offer a course at FSI about USIA and how its culture might integrate with the culture of the Department of State. And the FSI and the State Department bureaucracy required each bureau to send to this two-day seminar at FSI a senior officer, Assistant Secretary or DAS or Executive Director. So there were about 33 people in the room. Of those 33, one of them was a senior officer, and the other 32 had been designated to come to the seminar in lieu of senior officers who were too busy to attend. Second brief story is a year after the merger, I was invited to join an inspection team, and I had the great privilege of going to London for 6 weeks to inspect post the USIA in particular. And as you know, one of the first things that happens on an inspection is meeting with each section and saying what are the issues. And the issue I heard first from USIA was, we are chained to our desks. We can't get out of here. So what we did was we had the officers keep a diary during the 6 weeks of what they were doing hour by hour. They hated that, I'll tell you. But we did that. And at the end of the period, confirmed by the data that the officers had given us that they were spending either out of the embassy talking to colleagues or on the telephone talking professionally to a British colleague a total of 10% across the 6 weeks, across all the officers, 10% of their time. And we recommended that the mission should set a goal of moving that up to 25%. It seemed to me to be too low. That's what the goal was. And the then PAO said to me, you guys gotta be kidding. Do you think that will actually work? And 2 years later, when she left the post and I asked her, did it work? She said, you gotta be kidding. It did not change. It couldn't change because of what was expected by the ambassador. My question is training for the panel. Is there adequate training now for the craft of public diplomacy, which is quite different than the other crafts in foreign service?
Okay. Was there one more? Yeah, Mike, why don't you do and then we'll sum up and answer.
Yeah, Mike Anderson. I was PAO in big posts like Philippines, India, and Indonesia when the consolidation was just happening. It seemed to me from day one the problem was that from a field perspective that the admin support was gutted. The PD office was simply gutted. We lost our American exec officer, we had positions downgraded, we lost our computer person and our budget person, and if we were lucky, we still had a secretary or maybe an admin assistant or 1/8 of an admin assistant. So over the 20 years, has anything been done to correct the admin support issue, which is very nitty-gritty, very practical, but it impacts morale at post and your ability to do anything and get away from your desk?
Okay, so let's start with Jean and then we'll...
Hi, Mike. Good to see you. So, as a former exec officer, issues that I felt very personally about the difference that made to whether our PD offices could really function at their highest potential and get people out the door, get them engaged, and leave the management function into capable hands. What's been done since then? There is no real American officer that is in charge of that function. That function has largely been supplemented and in charge of a local employee for that function. And so there's no American officers that are really doing that role anymore, but it is local employees designated, and then other management functions have obviously shifted over to ICAS providers. But in terms of general operation of a PD section, in terms of budgeting, grant writing, all of those things, that is being done inside the section with maybe an American officer oversight, but not a specialty corps like we used to have as an executive officer.
I know that's the situation, but my question was, has anything been done in 20 years to improve that?
Well, I would say
it's a
the
problem.
things that have been done to improve that are certain things are no longer done in a public affairs section. So you've reduced what has to be done in a public affairs section to those critical items that are unique to public affairs. The other items have gone to the ICAS panel, ICAS operations and traditional management functions. But yeah, it's a huge loss, there's no doubt about it. And it impacts operations. And I would say one of the things that's changed for the future is the shift between bilateral and regional issues. So I think that is just going, the trend is all in that direction. We used to focus on bilateral issues, now it's much more regional, and how you get our embassies engaged across missions. So not just internally, but across missions. Coming from El Salvador, we were engaged daily with Guatemala and Honduras because we were working the strategy together. If you're going to work on Customs Border Patrol and you fix one side of the border, but you're not prioritizing the other side in another country, at the end of the day, it doesn't work. And so as we look forward on public diplomacy and where the issues are going, it is much more regional issues, less bilateral, and much more coordination and across mission, of which public diplomacy leads the way.
Shawn, I think there are two outstanding questions. One is whether Pompeo will change things, and also training. You can choose one. Or you can sum up your own thoughts.
Well, I'll just comment on training.
Good choice.
The answer,
Those people who are still working.
yeah, the answer is no. There's insufficient training, I think, across public diplomacy practitioners, regardless of the different exchange programs, strategic communications professionals, journalists. We all lack training compared to our peers and our competitors abroad. I think also if you look at the DoD and their model for training, it's far more robust than anything the State Department has. And so I think that's an obvious place we can do a lot better.
I'm really not qualified to speak to Secretary Pompeo's proclivity for change, but I must say that quite a bit has been changed for this perspective of somebody who's been out for a long time. There has been quite a bit of change. Whether it's changed for the better or the worse, I don't know, but there has been change. New organizational symbols and so on. As far as the as training is concerned, there too, I find there has been an effort at FSI to pick up some of the slack on tradecraft training. Courses that didn't exist when I was in the service exist now. How to be an information officer, how to be a CAO, how to do this kind of grant making and so on, which I assume is helpful.
Well, I think we are running over time, but I think it's the sort of subject that requires a little bit of expansion. And I just wanted to thank the panel. I want to thank all the people who are conducting public diplomacy out in the field right now or in headquarters. I want to thank all of you who did excellent work in the old USIA days and in the period between USIA now. Because I've always thought that if you looked at diplomacy writ large, public diplomacy was not a subset. That communicating diplomatically is what we did. And so it's a great pleasure to have had this chance to mark 20 years under the State Department and even more years, 40 or 50 years of the good work we've done overseas.